There are moments in life when you realize that fate has handed you a golden opportunity to deliver justice. That day, I stood in front of my withering greenhouse, staring across the fence at Karen Williams' perfectly manicured lawn, lush and green despite our community's severe drought restrictions. Just yesterday, she had cut off my water supply to protect community aesthetics and resources, as her official HOA notice stated. What she didn't know was that behind my garden, I had discovered an old storm drain system that I'd been quietly studying for weeks, and with a major rainstorm in the forecast, I suddenly had the perfect idea for some karmic retribution. If you're watching this video from California, comment Team Justice below, so I know who's following along. Now let me tell you the story of how the most powerful HOA tyrant in our neighborhood received the most memorable lesson of her life, courtesy of the very rules she claimed to protect. I moved to the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. During our investigation of the flooding incident, we received an anonymous tip regarding financial improprieties within this HOA. Given what I'm hearing, these concerns appear valid. Karen's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "Someone is clearly deflecting attention from their vandalism of my property." Detective Rodriguez remained impassive. "Ms. Williams, we've reviewed Mr. Real's security footage. While it shows him examining the drainage valve, there's no conclusive evidence of malicious intent." He paused before continuing. "However, we've found something interesting in our extended investigation. Records show you've been involved in similar disputes in 3 other communities. In each case, properties that refused to sell to you experienced mysterious damages or code violations." A collective gasp went through the room. "Furthermore, a title search reveals you've quietly acquired 5 properties in this development over the past 3 years, all after their owners experienced unexplained problems that led them to sell below market value." He addressed the whole room. "We'll be conducting a full investigation. I advise this board to perform an independent audit of its financial records." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Karen attempted to call for adjournment, but Robert Thompson quickly called for an emergency vote, and within minutes, Karen was temporarily removed from her position, pending investigation. As people broke into animated discussion groups, Dave made his way to my side, a strange expression on his face. "We need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing toward the exit. Lisa, Dave, and I slipped out of the clubhouse and walked in silence until we reached Dave's house. Once inside, Dave closed the blinds before turning to face me with an enigmatic smile. "There's something you should know," he began. "Something I haven't told anyone else." The previous weekend, I had been clearing out some overgrown brambles at the far end of my property when my shovel hit something metal. Curious, I dug around it and discovered what appeared to be an old valve connected to a large pipe. It wasn't on any of the property maps I'd received when purchasing the house, so I took a few photos and showed them to Dave the next day. His eyes had widened with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he'd said, examining the pictures closely. "That's part of the original storm drainage system from before the neighborhood was upgraded 15 years ago. They were supposed to decommission all of these, but I guess they missed this one." Dave explained that the neighborhood had been built in the 1970s with a basic drainage system that directed rainwater from the higher properties, like mine, down toward a man-made lake at the edge of the development. When the system was updated in the mid-2000s, most of the old infrastructure was supposed to be removed or permanently sealed. "This is fascinating," I told Dave, my curiosity piqued. "So where does this particular drain lead?" Dave scratched his chin thoughtfully. "If I remember correctly, this branch would run directly under several properties on the downslope, including—" He trailed off, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Including Karen's prize-winning lawn." I laughed at the coincidence, but Dave wasn't done. "You know what's interesting? When they were updating the system, each homeowner was supposed to approve the work on their property. Most of us did, but a few holdouts delayed the project for months. Karen was the most vocal opponent. She refused to have her lawn dug up for the new drain lines, said it would ruin her landscaping. Dave shook his head at the memory. The engineers had to reroute the entire system around her property, which is why some of the other houses still get drainage issues during heavy rains. This information was interesting but not immediately useful until Karen cut off my greenhouse water. The day after discovering my severed water line, I decided to investigate the old drainage valve more thoroughly. Using some of my IT salary to take a day off work, I carefully excavated around the valve, revealing a substantial concrete junction box. The system was more sophisticated than I'd expected, with multiple control points and a surprisingly robust metal valve that had been protected from corrosion by the concrete housing. I took detailed photos and measurements, then visited the county records office to look up the original construction plans. The clerk was helpful, providing me with scanned copies of the neighborhood's original drainage blueprints. Back at home, I spread them across my dining table, studying them intently as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. According to the plans, the drain line ran directly beneath 4 properties, including Karen's, before emptying into the community lake. More importantly, it appeared that the junction box on my property was the main control point for this entire branch of the system. In theory, if the valve was still functional, opening it during a rainstorm would allow water to flow through the original pipes that now lay dormant beneath Karen's meticulously landscaped yard. A plan began forming in my mind, but I needed expert confirmation. I texted Dave asking if he could stop by to look at my findings. Within 20 minutes, he was at my door, reading glasses perched on his nose as he examined the blueprints with professional interest. "These old systems were built to last," he commented, tracing the path with his finger, "unlike the plastic junk they use these days." "So if I were to open this valve during a rainstorm," I began, trying to sound casual. Dave looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You'd be redirecting a significant amount of water through pipes that haven't been used in over a decade, potentially causing unpredictable drainage patterns in the downstream properties." He studied my face for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his weathered features. "I definitely wouldn't recommend it, especially not with the storm system moving in this weekend. The Weather Service is predicting up to 3 inches of rain." He tapped the blueprints meaningfully. "And definitely not when someone has intentionally avoided upgrading their drainage infrastructure because they didn't want to disturb their precious lawn." I couldn't help but return his smile. "Of course not. I'm just curious about the neighborhood's history for educational purposes." Dave nodded, the twinkle in his eye telling me he understood perfectly well what I was contemplating. "Education is important. So is being prepared for changing weather conditions." As Dave left, he casually mentioned that the lake's water level had been intentionally lowered the previous week to prepare for the coming storm, creating additional capacity. "Just an interesting fact," he called over his shoulder as he headed back to his house. I stood in my doorway, watching him go, the pieces of a perfect plan falling into place in my mind. That evening, I received a text from Lisa Chen, asking if I'd found a solution to my greenhouse water problem. I invited her over to see what I'd discovered. As an environmental attorney, she examined the blueprints with professional interest, immediately grasping the implications. "Let me get this straight," she said, leaning back in my dining chair. "Karen refused to allow the drainage upgrade on her property, and now you've found a way to activate the old system that runs right under her yard?" I nodded, watching her face closely for signs of disapproval. Instead, I saw a slow smile spread across her features. "You know, there's nothing illegal about restoring existing infrastructure on your own property, especially if it's for water management during a predicted storm event." She winked at me. "Just make sure you document everything, for liability purposes, of course." By the time Lisa left, I had not only a plan, but the beginnings of legal protection should things go sideways. The weather forecast confirmed Dave's prediction. A major storm system was moving in, expected to hit our area late Saturday afternoon. I spent Friday testing the valve mechanism, carefully working it open and closed to ensure it functioned properly without actually allowing any water through yet. I also set up a discrete camera system that would record my yard and the visible portion of Karen's property beyond the fence. If I was going to do this, I wanted evidence of exactly what happened and when. As the sun set Friday evening, I stood in my backyard, looking at the inconspicuous metal valve that was about to become the instrument of poetic justice. The forecast had been updated. The storm was intensifying, with potential rainfall amounts now approaching 4 inches. And through my kitchen window, I could see Karen directing a landscaping crew that was laying fresh sod on portions of her lawn, preparing for the garden party she'd been loudly planning all week. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Saturday morning dawned gray and ominous, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon. I checked the weather app on my phone. The storm was accelerating, now expected to hit by mid-afternoon instead of evening. Through my window, I could see unusual activity at Karen's house. Despite the impending downpour, she appeared to be setting up for an outdoor gathering. Lawn furniture was being arranged on her patio, and a catering van had pulled into her driveway. I recalled the neighborhood email she'd sent earlier in the week, inviting select HOA members to an exclusive garden showcase featuring her drought-resistant landscaping techniques. The irony was almost too perfect. She had scheduled her self-congratulatory event on the very day nature was about to unleash its fury, and she had specifically not invited me, making a point to mention that some residents weren't included due to ongoing compliance issues. I spent the morning making final preparations. First, I checked the valve mechanism one last time, ensuring it would open smoothly when the time came. Then I strategically positioned my security cameras to capture multiple angles of both my property and the visible portions of Karen's yard. I had no intention of damaging her property. I simply wanted to restore the original water flow patterns that she had disrupted with her refusal to upgrade. If that happened to create some inconvenience during her garden party, well, that was just an unfortunate coincidence. Around noon, I received a text from Dave. Storm intensifying offshore. Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for the county. ETA 3 p.m. I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji, my heart rate accelerating with anticipation. Karen's guests began arriving around 1 p.m., a parade of luxury vehicles pulling into her circular driveway. I recognized most of the HOA board members among them, along with what appeared to be potential clients for her real estate business. Through my kitchen window, I watched as she greeted each arrival with air kisses and led them to her backyard, where white tents had been erected to provide some protection from the increasingly threatening sky. I could hear her voice carrying across the fence, boasting about her water-wise landscaping choices and how she was leading by example during the drought. The catering staff moved efficiently between the house and yard, setting up an elaborate spread on white cloth tables. By 2 p.m., the party was in full swing despite the darkening clouds, with Karen holding court among her sycophants. The first fat raindrops began to fall at 2:30, sending Karen's guests scurrying under the tents. I watched through my window as she reassured everyone that it would be just a light shower and directed the caterers to continue serving. By 2:45, the light shower had become a steady downpour, with water beginning to pool on my lawn. I pulled on a rain jacket and boots, then stepped outside, ostensibly to check on my greenhouse. The rain was coming down hard now, drumming on the greenhouse roof and creating small rivulets across my yard. Perfect conditions. I casually made my way to the back corner of my property, where the drainage valve was located, partially hidden by a decorative boulder I'd placed there earlier in the week. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, I knelt down and, with a specialized wrench I'd purchased for this purpose, slowly began to turn the valve. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The valve was stiff from years of disuse, requiring more force than I'd anticipated. For a moment I worried that it might be completely seized or that the underground pipes had collapsed. But then, with a groaning sound that was thankfully masked by the pounding rain, the valve began to turn. I rotated it a full 180 degrees, then quickly retreated to my back porch, where I could observe the effects while remaining relatively dry. For several minutes, nothing changed. The rain continued to fall, and the sounds of Karen's party, now somewhat subdued by the downpour, drifted over the fence. Had my plan failed? Was the system too degraded to function after all these years? I was beginning to think I'd miscalculated when I heard the first scream. It wasn't a scream of terror exactly, more like a cry of surprise and dismay. From my vantage point, I couldn't see what was happening, but the alarmed voices from Karen's yard were growing louder. I quickly moved to my side gate, which offered a better view of her property. What I saw exceeded my wildest expectations. The ground in the center of Karen's pristine lawn had begun to bubble, like a miniature geyser preparing to erupt. As I watched, the pressure built until a section of newly laid sod bulged upward, water seeping through the seams. Then, with a sound like a wet burp, the bubble burst, and a fountain of muddy water shot 3 feet into the air, spraying several of Karen's white-clad guests. The look of utter horror on Karen's face was something I will treasure until my dying day. The chaos that ensued was magnificent. Guests scattered in all directions, abandoning plates of catered food and glasses of expensive wine. The pristine white tents began to sag as the water rose, and the lawn furniture started to sink into the increasingly sodden ground. But the best part was Karen herself. Her designer outfit, now splattered with mud, her perfectly coiffed hair plastered to her head, running frantically between erupting bubbles in her lawn as if she could somehow stomp them back down. I retreated to my house, not wanting to appear too interested in her predicament. Through my window, I watched as the guests fled to their cars, leaving Karen and her landscaping crew to battle the emerging water disaster with inadequate tools. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. As the afternoon wore on, the rain intensified and the situation in Karen's yard deteriorated further. What had begun as a few bubbling spots had transformed into a network of miniature rivers, all converging to create what could only be described as a muddy lake, where her award-winning lawn had once been. The fresh sod floated like bizarre islands on this newly formed body of water, occasionally spinning in the current. From my vantage point, I could see Karen on her phone, gesticulating wildly as she presumably called for emergency assistance. Her landscapers had long since abandoned their efforts, standing helplessly at the perimeter as their expensive work was washed away before their eyes. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening approached. I made myself a cup of hot coffee and continued to monitor the situation through my window, occasionally checking the security camera feeds on my laptop. The transformation of Karen's property was remarkable. Where there had once been an immaculate lawn with geometric precision, there was now a chaotic swamp. At around 6 p.m., a municipal truck pulled up to her house, and 2 workers in rain gear examined the scene briefly before shaking their heads. Even through the pounding rain, I could hear Karen's voice rising in pitch as she demanded they do something, anything, to save her lawn. One of the workers gestured at the storm drains on the street, which were already struggling to handle the rainfall, then at her property, clearly explaining that they couldn't divert resources to her private landscaping issues during a weather emergency. As darkness fell, the true extent of the damage became clear. The security lights around Karen's property illuminated a scene of complete devastation. Her once perfect lawn was now unrecognizable, a muddy pond that had begun to encroach on her paved patio area. Occasional flashes of lightning revealed garden furniture tipped over and partially submerged, decorative planters floating like wayward boats, and the white tents from her party collapsed into sodden heaps. I watched as she made one last desperate attempt to create some kind of makeshift dam with landscape timbers and plastic sheeting, only to see it immediately overwhelmed by the relentless water. Finally, around 8 p.m., she retreated into her house, defeated. I decided it was time to close the valve. I'd made my point, and I didn't want to risk any structural damage to her home, which would cross the line from justified retribution into malicious destruction. Donning my rain gear once more, I sloshed through my backyard to the drainage valve. The ground was saturated, making the going difficult, but the valve was still accessible. With some effort, I managed to close it, though I doubted it would make much difference at this point. The damage was done, and the continuing rain would keep things flooded until the storm passed. As I turned to head back to my house, a beam of light suddenly cut through the darkness, illuminating my face. "What exactly are you doing out here in this weather, Mr. Reynolds?" Karen's voice was tight with suspicion and barely contained rage. She stood at the property line, a large flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, rain pouring off an inadequate umbrella. Her designer outfit was ruined, her makeup streaked down her face, and her hair plastered to her head, yet somehow she still managed to project an aura of imperious entitlement. "Just checking on my greenhouse," I replied calmly, gesturing toward the structure. "With all this rain, I wanted to make sure the roof was holding up." Karen's eyes narrowed as she swept her flashlight beam across my yard, then back to where I stood near the disguised valve. "Interesting that your property seems perfectly fine while mine is being destroyed," she said, her voice dripping with accusation. "Almost as if someone deliberately targeted my home?" I maintained my composure, meeting her gaze steadily. "That's a serious allegation, Karen. Perhaps if you'd allowed the drainage system upgrades 15 years ago, instead of exempting your property to protect your lawn, you wouldn't be having these issues now." Her eyes widened in surprise that I knew this history, then narrowed again with fury. "This isn't over, Reynolds," she spat, turning on her heel. "I'll have engineers out here tomorrow, and if I find any evidence that you've tampered with anything, I'll sue you into the next century." I watched her splash back toward her house, then return to my own home, a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension churning in my stomach. Had I gone too far? I reviewed the security footage, ensuring I had documentation of exactly what had happened and when. The cameras had captured Karen's visit to my property as well, including her threats. I saved multiple backups of all the footage just in case. Around midnight, my phone chimed with a text from Dave. "Quite a storm, eh? Hope your greenhouse is holding up. Karen's lawn, on the other hand, yikes." I smiled at his deliberate casualness and replied simply, "Greenhouse is fine. Karma's a funny thing." Dave sent back a laughing emoji, followed by, "Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow afternoon. This should be interesting." I slept fitfully that night, the continuing storm and my own churning thoughts making rest difficult. By morning, the rain had finally stopped, giving way to a brilliantly clear sky that seemed to mock the destruction below. From my bedroom window, I surveyed Karen's property in the morning light. It was, if anything, worse than it had appeared the night before. Her entire lawn was gone, replaced by a muddy expanse dotted with debris. The water level had receded somewhat, revealing trenches where the underground pipes had forced their way to the surface. As I watched, a small convoy of vehicles pulled into her driveway. A municipal utilities truck, what appeared to be a private engineering firm, and a police cruiser. Things were about to get serious. I showered and dressed carefully, selecting attire that projected responsible homeowner rather than vengeful saboteur. Then I made a strategic phone call to Lisa Chen, briefly explaining the situation and asking for her advice. "Don't volunteer any information," she cautioned after hearing my account. "If questioned directly by authorities, be truthful but minimal. Simply state that you discovered old infrastructure on your property and were investigating it during the storm. Don't mention opening the valve unless specifically asked." She paused, then added, "I'll attend the HOA meeting this afternoon. This could get interesting." Before hanging up, she promised to stop by beforehand so we could arrive together. A show of solidarity I appreciated. Around 10 a.m., there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a police officer and a man in the uniform of the municipal water department standing on my porch. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Officer Rodriguez. We're investigating the flooding incident at the Williams property next door. Do you have a few minutes to answer some questions?" His tone was professional but not accusatory. I invited them in, projecting calm cooperation. "Of course, happy to help however I can. It was quite a storm, wasn't it? I was worried about my greenhouse, but thankfully it survived intact." The water department representative introduced himself as Frank Torres, explaining that they were trying to understand why Ms. Williams' property had experienced such severe localized flooding when the surrounding homes had been relatively unaffected. I offered them coffee, which they accepted, giving me a moment to gather my thoughts as I prepared the drinks. When I returned to the living room, Officer Rodriguez had taken out a notepad. "Mr. Torres tells me there's an old drainage system in this neighborhood that was supposedly decommissioned years ago. Were you aware of this?" I took a sip of my coffee before answering, remembering Lisa's advice to be truthful, but minimal. "Yes, I recently discovered what appears to be part of the old system in my backyard. I was quite surprised as it wasn't indicated in any of the property documents I received when purchasing the house." Torres leaned forward with interest. "Can you show us what you found?" I nodded, leading them through the house and into the backyard. The ground was still soggy from the rain, but navigable. As we approached the corner where the valve was located, I kept my explanation simple and factual. "I discovered this while clearing some overgrowth a few weeks ago. Based on county records I looked up, it appears to be a junction box for the original drainage system." I moved the decorative boulder aside, revealing the valve mechanism. Torres knelt to examine it, his expression thoughtful. "This is definitely part of the old system. It should have been permanently sealed when the new infrastructure was installed." He looked up at me, his gaze direct, but not accusatory. "Has this valve been operated recently, Mr. Reynolds?" Here was the direct question Lisa had warned about. I maintained eye contact, keeping my voice steady. "I was examining it during the storm, yes. I was curious about how the old system worked, especially with all that rain coming down. It was quite stiff from disuse." Officer Rodriguez made notes while Torres continued his examination. "According to our records, Ms. Williams refused to allow the updated drainage system to be installed on her property," Torres commented, almost conversationally. "The engineers had to create a workaround which was less than optimal for overall neighborhood drainage." I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral. "Yes, I'd heard something about that from Dave Johnson. He's lived here since before the upgrades." Rodriguez looked up from his notepad. "So in your understanding, this valve would control water flow to a pipe that runs under Ms. Williams' property?" I spread my hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "Based on the old blueprints I found at the county records office, that appears to be the case. But I'm not an engineer. I was just curious about the neighborhood's infrastructure." Torres stood up, brushing mud from his knees. "Well, it looks like what happened is pretty straightforward. This old system became active during the storm, channeling water directly under Ms. Williams' lawn. Given the volume of rainfall and the fact that her property wasn't properly integrated into the new drainage system, the water had nowhere to go but up." He gave me a look that suggested he wasn't entirely buying my innocent curiosity, but also wasn't particularly troubled by Karen's predicament. "I'll need to include this in my report, but from a municipal standpoint, this falls under private property disputes. The city can't be responsible for homeowners who opted out of critical infrastructure upgrades." Officer Rodriguez closed his notepad. "Unless there's evidence of deliberate sabotage, which doesn't appear to be the case here, this is a civil matter between neighbors and the HOA." As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez handed me his card. "If you recall any other details that might be relevant, please give me a call." His expression was unreadable, but I sensed he wasn't particularly sympathetic to Karen's situation either. Once they were gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The official response seemed to be exactly what Lisa had predicted. Without clear evidence of malicious intent, this would be treated as an unfortunate consequence of Karen's own past decisions. I sent quick texts to both Dave and Lisa updating them on the visit. Dave replied with a simple "told you so," while Lisa confirmed she'd be by at 2 p.m. for the HOA meeting. As I awaited the afternoon's confrontation, I couldn't help but feel that justice, while perhaps not entirely through proper channels, had been served. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the community clubhouse. Lisa arrived at my house as promised, dressed in a professional suit that subtly conveyed her legal authority. "Remember," she advised as we walked toward the clubhouse, "admit to nothing beyond what you've already told the authorities. Let Karen dig her own grave with accusations. The more outlandish her claims, the less credible she'll appear." I nodded, appreciating her strategy. "What about the greenhouse water issue? Should I bring that up?" Lisa considered for a moment. Yes, but frame it as a concern about arbitrary rule enforcement, not as justification for retaliation. We want to position you as the reasonable party here. The clubhouse was already buzzing with conversation when we arrived. Nearly every homeowner in the development had turned out, drawn by the drama of Karen's flooded lawn and the hastily called emergency meeting. Karen herself was holding court near the front of the room, surrounded by her few remaining allies on the board. She looked considerably less polished than usual, with visible stress lines around her eyes and her hair hastily styled. She shot me a venomous glare as Lisa and I entered, then whispered something to the board treasurer beside her. Dave was already seated toward the back, and he gave us a subtle nod as we joined him. "You've become quite the neighborhood celebrity overnight," he murmured as we sat down. "Everyone's talking about Karen's mysterious flood." At precisely 3 p.m., Karen called the meeting to order, her voice brittle with barely controlled rage. "As you all know, my property sustained severe damage during last night's storm due to what appears to be a deliberate act of sabotage." Murmurs rippled through the room as homeowners exchanged glances. Karen continued. "The old drainage system that was supposed to be decommissioned 15 years ago was somehow activated, directing water specifically under my property. This resulted in catastrophic damage to my landscaping and potential structural issues with my foundation." She paused, her gaze settling on me like a targeting laser. "And I believe I know exactly who is responsible." Before she could continue her accusation, the vice president of the HOA, retired judge named Robert Thompson, cleared his throat. "Before we proceed with unfounded allegations, Karen, I believe we should hear from the municipal authorities who investigated this morning. Have they provided any official determination?" Karen's face tightened. "They've filed a preliminary report classifying it as a private property dispute, but that's because they don't have all the facts yet." Robert nodded slowly. "And what facts would those be? Do you have evidence of deliberate action by another homeowner?" Karen's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Not yet, but the circumstances are extremely suspicious. Reynolds' property was completely unaffected while mine was destroyed, and we all know he had motive after the water restriction vote." Lisa chose this moment to stand up. "If I may address the board, Lisa Chen, Lot 3434. I'm concerned about the direction of this meeting. Making public accusations without evidence could expose the HOA to liability for defamation." Several heads nodded in agreement as she continued. "Furthermore, I'd like to point out that Mr. Reynolds has been fully cooperative with authorities, showing them the infrastructure he discovered on his property. If anyone bears responsibility for this unfortunate incident, it would be whoever decided to exempt certain properties from the drainage upgrade 15 years ago." Her pointed look at Karen caused another ripple of murmurs through the audience. Karen's face flushed with anger. "That decision was made to preserve the aesthetic integrity of—" She was interrupted by Frank Torres from the water department, who had slipped into the back of the room during the discussion. "Actually, I'd like to clarify something for the record." All heads turned toward him as he moved to the front. "Our department strongly recommended against exempting any properties from the drainage upgrade. We warned that doing so could lead to exactly this type of failure during extreme weather events. This warning was documented and acknowledged by the HOA president at that time." He paused, looking directly at Karen. "Which, according to our records, was Ms. Williams." The room erupted into conversation as this revelation sank in. Karen had essentially created the very vulnerability that had destroyed her lawn. As the noise level rose, something unexpected happened. The treasurer, a nervous man named Walter, who had always been Karen's staunch ally, suddenly stood up. "I think we should all know something else," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This morning, after the flooding, Karen asked me to approve an emergency disbursement from the HOA reserve fund to pay for her lawn restoration. When I reminded her that such expenditures require board approval, she implied that certain irregularities in the HOA accounts might come to light if I didn't cooperate." A shocked silence fell over the room. Walter continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "This made me curious, so I reviewed our financial records more carefully than usual. I've found numerous discrepancies over the past 3 years. landscaping services charged to the HOA but apparently performed only on Karen's property, administrative expenses without receipts, and consultant fees paid to a company that appears to be registered in Karen's daughter's name. The bombshell revelation transformed the meeting instantly. Karen's face had drained of color, and she stammered as she tried to regain control. Those are approved expenses for community beautification projects centered around the model home area, which happens to be my property. Everything was properly authorized. Robert Thompson's voice cut through her excuses like a knife. Authorized by whom, Karen? The board votes on all expenditures over $500, and I don't recall approving personal landscaping services. As Karen struggled to respond, a new voice joined the fray. Detective Rodriguez had entered silently during the commotion and now stood by the door observing the proceedings with professional interest. In the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. During our investigation of the flooding incident, we received an anonymous tip regarding potential financial improprieties within this HOA. Given what I'm hearing now, it seems those concerns may have merit. Karen's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "Someone is clearly trying to deflect attention from their vandalism of my property." Detective Rodriguez remained impassive. "Ms. Williams, we've reviewed the security camera footage from Mr. Reynolds' property, which shows the entire sequence of events during the storm. While it does show him examining the drainage valve, there's no conclusive evidence of malicious intent." He paused, letting this sink in before continuing. "However, we did find something interesting when we extended our investigation. A record search revealed that you've been involved in similar disputes in 3 other communities before moving here. In each case, properties that refused to sell to you experienced mysterious damages or code violations shortly after." A collective gasp went through the room. Rodriguez continued, his voice measured and professional. "Furthermore, a title search shows that you've quietly acquired 5 properties in this development over the past 3 years, all after their owners experienced unexplained problems that led them to sell below market value." He turned to address the whole room. "We'll be conducting a full investigation into these matters. In the meantime, I'd advise this board to conduct an independent audit of its financial records." The meeting dissolved into chaos after Rodriguez's bombshell. Karen attempted to call for adjournment, but Robert Thompson quickly called for an emergency vote, and within minutes, Karen was temporarily removed from her position pending investigation. As people broke into animated discussion groups, Dave made his way to my side, a strange expression on his face. "We need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing toward the exit. Lisa, Dave, and I slipped out of the clubhouse and walked in silence until we reached Dave's house, which was farther from the clubhouse than mine and offered more privacy. Once inside, Dave closed the blinds before turning to face me with an enigmatic smile. "There's something you should know," he began, "something I haven't told anyone else." Dave disappeared into his study and returned with a faded manila folder. 10 years ago," he began, spreading old photographs across his kitchen table, "my brother and his wife lived in your house." I stared at him in surprise. He had never mentioned this connection before. They had transformed the backyard into an award-winning vegetable garden. My sister-in-law was a botanist, and that garden was her pride and joy. He pointed to a photo showing an elderly couple standing proudly beside lush garden beds where my greenhouse now stood. Karen had just moved into the neighborhood and was beginning her takeover of the HOA. She immediately cited them for multiple violations, all of which were suddenly created under her leadership. Lisa leaned forward, examining the photos. "Let me guess, she wanted their property?" Dave nodded grimly. "Exactly. It was the perfect location for what she called her neighborhood beautification plan, which was really just a way to increase the value of her adjacent investments. When they refused to sell, mysterious problems began. Their garden irrigation was vandalized, anonymous complaints were filed, their mail went missing, including property tax notices." His voice hardened. "The final straw came during a heavy rainstorm, much like yesterday's. Somehow water was diverted into their basement, destroying family heirlooms and forcing them to temporarily move out. The financial and emotional strain was too much, and they sold to the first buyer, a shell company linked to Karen. I sat back, stunned by this revelation. So, that's why you were so interested in the old drainage system? Dave's eyes gleamed. When you showed me what you'd found, I recognized it immediately. After my brother sold, I suspected Karen had manipulated the water flow during that storm, but I could never prove it. I'd been watching and waiting for years. He pulled out another document, detailed technical drawings of the drainage junction box on my property. After they moved, I took early retirement from the water department and bought my house here specifically to keep an eye on Karen. I've spent years mapping the old systems, documenting her schemes, and waiting for the right moment. Wait, I said, connecting the dots. Are you saying you knew exactly how that valve worked all along? Dave's smile was both mischievous and triumphant. Let's just say that when you discovered it, I saw an opportunity for poetic justice. And perhaps I made some improvements to the system over the years. The original pipes wouldn't have created such a spectacular effect without a little help. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a small device, a battery-powered pump injector installed 5 years ago during a routine gardening project. Once the valve was opened, it activated automatically, increasing the water pressure in those old pipes. Lisa gasped, "Dave, that's definitely illegal." Despite her words, she was fighting a smile. Dave shrugged. Technically, I was just maintaining historical infrastructure on my property. The pipes cross multiple lots, after all. He turned to me. I couldn't tell you beforehand, your reaction had to be genuine, but I've been collecting evidence against Karen for years. The detective didn't receive an anonymous tip. He received a meticulously documented file from a retired municipal engineer concerned about infrastructure integrity. The implications slowly sank in. He hadn't just helped me, he had orchestrated the perfect revenge scenario, using me as an unwitting accomplice while ensuring I remained legally protected. So all those things you told me about the drainage system, I began. Dave nodded. All completely accurate. I just omitted the part about my personal enhancements to the system, and perhaps I neglected to mention that I've been documenting Karen's activities for years. He closed the folder and looked at us both seriously. What happened yesterday was justice, pure and simple. Karen has been manipulating this community, harming people like my brother, and illegally profiting for years. She finally experienced the consequences of her own actions. Lisa shook her head, though her expression was more admiring than disapproving. As your attorney, I would advise you both to never speak of this to anyone else. She paused, then added with a small smile. As your friend, I'd say it's about time someone stood up to her. We spent the next hour discussing the likely outcomes of the investigations into Karen's activities. Dave was confident that the financial audit would reveal more extensive wrongdoing, while Lisa provided insights into the potential legal consequences. By the time we left Dave's house, a plan was in place for the coming weeks, one that would ensure the neighborhood's recovery while maintaining our plausible deniability. The following days brought a flurry of activity to our normally quiet community. Forensic auditors descended on the HOA records, Karen was served with multiple subpoenas, and work crews began assessing the damage to her property. I kept a low profile, focusing on my greenhouse, which was thriving now that I had reinstalled my irrigation system with the full blessing of the interim HOA board. A week after the flood, as I was tending to my tomato plants, a shadow fell across the greenhouse door. I looked up to find Detective Rodriguez standing there. "Mr. Reynolds," he said by way of greeting, "your vegetables are looking healthy." "Thank you," I replied cautiously. "Is there something I can help you with?" He surveyed the greenhouse before answering. "Just tying up some loose ends. You know, it's interesting how things work out sometimes." He fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "The pump device we found attached to that old drainage system was quite sophisticated, not the sort of thing an IT engineer would typically install." My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression neutral. "A pump?" "I'm not sure what you mean." Rodriguez's smile was knowing but not unkind. "No, I don't suppose you do. Just as I don't suppose you realize that your security camera footage had an interesting 2-minute gap precisely when that valve was being opened." He held up a hand as I began to respond. "Don't worry, these technical glitches happen all the time, especially during electrical storms." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Ms. Williams has been charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and filing false reports. Her empire is crumbling rather spectacularly." With that, he walked away, leaving me to wonder just how much he knew and had chosen to overlook. 3 months after the flood, life in Oak Ridge Estates had transformed dramatically. The independent audit had revealed the full extent of Karen's financial misdeeds. Over $200,000 in HOA funds had been diverted to her personal projects and shell companies over the years. She was facing multiple felony charges, had been forced to sell her house to cover legal expenses, and had become a cautionary tale in HOA management circles across the state. Her real estate holdings were being investigated by a task force that included Detective Rodriguez, who occasionally stopped by my greenhouse for fresh tomatoes and cryptic conversations. The HOA itself had undergone a complete transformation. After Karen's removal, an interim board led by Robert Thompson had implemented sweeping reforms, including transparent financial reporting, term limits for board members, and a complete overhaul of the community regulations. When elections were held a month later, I was surprised to find myself nominated for the board. Even more surprising was the overwhelming support I received from neighbors who had previously kept their distance. "You stood up to her when no one else would," explained Mrs. Peterson, an elderly resident who had lived in fear of Karen's arbitrary rule enforcement for years. "We need someone with that kind of integrity in charge." Karen was served with multiple subpoenas, and work crews began assessing the damage to her property. I kept a low profile, focusing on my greenhouse, which was thriving now that I had reinstalled my irrigation system with the full blessing of the interim HOA board. A week after the flood, as I was tending to my tomato plants, a shadow fell across the greenhouse door. I looked up to find Detective Rodriguez standing there, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds," he said by way of greeting, "your vegetables are looking healthy." "Thank you," I replied cautiously. "Is there something I can help you with?" He surveyed the greenhouse for a moment before answering, "Just tying up some loose ends in my investigation. You know, it's interesting how things work out sometimes." He fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "The pump device we found attached to that old drainage system was quite sophisticated. Not the sort of thing an IT engineer would typically install." My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression neutral. "A pump? I'm not sure what you mean." Rodriguez's smile was knowing but not unkind. "No, I don't suppose you do. Just as I don't suppose you realize that your security camera footage had an interesting 2-minute gap precisely when that valve was being opened." He held up a hand as I began to respond. "Huh, don't worry. These technical glitches happen all the time, especially during electrical storms." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and you might be interested to know that Miss Williams has been charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and filing false reports. It seems her empire is crumbling rather spectacularly." With that, he walked away, leaving me to wonder just how much he actually knew and had chosen to overlook in the interest of a greater justice.